He was the kind of man whose voice could silence storms, not with force, but with truth. Reverend Eli Monroe was known across the backroads of the American South, a traveling preacher with nothing but a worn Bible, a rusted pickup, and a heart that believed anyone could be saved if only they were seen. But in the spring of 1983, just after a revival under a rain-soaked tent in rural Georgia, he disappeared. No goodbye, no farewell sermon, just gone, as if swallowed by the road he loved so dearly. For decades, whispers followed him. Some said he left on purpose. Others believed he had been silenced for truths too sharp to speak. The towns he once visited kept his memory alive with candles, caution, and quiet prayers. But there was never a body, never a sign, only the stories. A preacher who changed lives in a single night and then vanished like smoke at dawn. The kind of story that aches to be solved, yet fears the answer. Then, 34 years later, in the heart of a burning building just outside Macon, a firefighter pulled something from the rubble. Charred, bent, barely recognizable, but unmistakably sacred. A badge, not of law, but of faith, etched with a cross, initials, and a date that hadn't been spoken aloud in years. Reverend Eli Monroe, 1983. The name that had become legend was suddenly real again. What happened to him? Why did he vanish? And how did this one fragment of his past survive decades of silence, only to resurface in fire? As the mystery unfolded, it became clear this wasn't just about a missing preacher. It was about the lives he touched, the truths he carried, and the reason some voices are buried not by accident, but by design. And what if the badge wasn't a remnant of what had been lost, but a signal of something still unfinished? Stay close, because once this story begins, it doesn't let go. Not until the final ember fades and the truth is finally spoken. The badge was found under collapsed timber, still warm from the blaze. Firefighter Samuel Hayes hadn't expected to find anything meaningful in the wreckage of an abandoned church set ablaze by lightning, let alone something tied to a man whose name had all but faded from local memory. Yet there it was, dented, blackened, but unmistakably engraved with Eli's initials. It didn't make sense. That church had been empty for years. The structure itself dated back to the 1940s, long condemned and forgotten. So how had the preacher's badge, lost in 1983, ended up here, untouched by time? Samuel brought the badge home that night, unable to sleep. He placed it on the table under a lamp, staring at it like it might speak. And in a way it did. That small piece of metal stirred something inside him, a vague memory of being a boy in his grandmother's lap, listening to stories of a man who could make sinners weep and atheists pray. Eli Monroe wasn't just a preacher. He was a presence, a firebrand, a man who showed up in dying towns, preached for 3 days straight, then vanished like a spirit driven by wind. The next morning, Samuel drove to his grandmother's nursing home with the badge in his pocket. When he showed it to her, her hands trembled. Her voice broke. "I never thought I'd see this again," she whispered. "That man saved your uncle's life." Samuel leaned in, stunned. He had never known his uncle. He had died before Samuel was born, or so he thought. But that morning, a new story emerged, one that had been buried under years of silence, shame, and spiritual mystery. She told him that Reverend Eli came to their town just after a suicide in the family. Samuel's uncle, a war veteran, was drinking himself to death. The preacher found him on the church steps, bottle in hand, eyes hollow. Eli didn't quote scripture. He didn't shout. He just sat beside him in the dark, for hours. And when the sun rose, the bottle was gone, and so was the uncle's despair. He lived another 5 years, sober and whole. Eli didn't just preach, she said. He listened the devil out of people. That same day, Samuel took the badge to the local library and began digging through archives, newspapers, anything he could find. And slowly, a pattern emerged, a path of towns where Eli had appeared, always unannounced, always after a tragedy, and always vanishing before anyone could thank him. But something strange caught Samuel's attention. Every one of those towns had experienced a fire not long after Eli's visit. Coincidence? Or something more? One clipping from 1978 described a barn fire outside Charleston that left behind only ashes, and one object recovered from the center of the blaze, a Bible with Eli Monroe's name etched in the back cover. No explanation, no context, just the image of the book resting in blackened soot, untouched by the flames. Samuel's hands shook as he read it. What kind of man left relics behind like breadcrumbs? And why did fire follow in his footsteps? Intrigued, Samuel drove to the remains of the Charleston site. There wasn't much left, only the stone foundation and the whispers of those who remembered. He met an elderly woman tending a flower bed nearby, who said she had seen Eli once. He didn't walk, she told Samuel, he glided, like the ground wasn't his to touch. She paused, and when he looked at you, it was like you couldn't lie, not even to yourself. Then, almost in a trance, she added, I never told anyone this, but that night the fire came out of nowhere. And it didn't destroy, it cleansed. Everywhere Samuel turned, the stories deepened. In one town, a corrupt sheriff resigned after Eli's sermon on truth. In another, a mother found her missing daughter the morning after Eli visited and prayed outside her home. These weren't just coincidences. They were disruptions, cracks in the ordinary that exposed something greater, something divine. And each story had a common ending: fire. Not as punishment, but as punctuation, as if Eli's presence left behind something that needed to burn to make space for healing. But why had he disappeared? Why had someone so impactful simply vanished without a trace? Samuel followed a fragile thread of rumors that Eli had gone too far in his final sermon, that he had uncovered something he wasn't meant to see. A secret, a crime, a truth too heavy for the world to carry. Some believed he had been silenced. Others said he was taken, not by men, but by something higher. But none of it explained why his badge, intact and glowing with memory, had just now come to light. As Samuel returned to the scene of the fire where it was found, he noticed something he hadn't before, a pattern scorched into the floorboards beneath the ash. Not random, not natural. It was a symbol, a flame enclosed in a circle, with a cross at its center. And suddenly, he realized, this wasn't just a mystery. It was a message. And maybe, just maybe, Eli Monroe wasn't finished speaking. Samuel traced the symbol with his fingertips, its groove still warm beneath the soot. It wasn't something left by accident. It was deliberate, as if burned in with purpose rather than consumed by chaos. He took a photo and sent it to a friend who studied religious symbology. The reply came quickly, but brought more questions than answers. That's not standard scripture. It's pre-schism Christian, desert mysticism, rare, protective. Samuel stared at the message. Protective? From what? He began to research symbols of early Christian wanderers, prophets and preachers who traveled without affiliation, feared by organized churches for their unconventional teachings. Many were branded as heretics, mystics, or worse. Some were even believed to wield spiritual gifts too potent to be safe. Eli Monroe, it seemed, followed that path. He preached love, yes, but it was never passive. It was the kind that burned down lies, uprooted secrets, and confronted hidden darkness. Digging deeper, Samuel found something chilling: a transcript of Eli's last recorded sermon in a small town called Marlow Creek, dated just weeks before his disappearance. The final lines read, "They say fire destroys. I say it reveals. Let the heat come. Let it burn. Because nothing of God will turn to ash, only what we've tried to hide." The recording abruptly ended. No applause, no benediction, just silence. And the very next day, the church in Marlow Creek went up in flames. Samuel knew now that this was no random disappearance. Eli had become dangerous, not because he preached destruction, but because he unearthed truths people would rather leave buried. The badge wasn't just a relic. It was a breadcrumb, a flare, and Samuel, unknowingly, had picked it up. That night, he dreamed of smoke curling beneath church pews, a man in a long coat walking calmly through fire, untouched. When Samuel awoke, his hands smelled faintly of ash. He drove to Marlow Creek the next morning. The town had never rebuilt the church. The site was fenced off, overgrown with weeds, and surrounded by quiet. But the air felt dense, charged. He stood at the center of the ruins, closed his eyes, and whispered the last line of Eli's sermon aloud. Let it burn. And in that moment, not metaphorically, not imaginatively, but undeniably, the wind stopped. The sun dimmed. and somewhere behind him, a single match lit itself. Samuel spun around, heart pounding, expecting someone behind him, but the place was empty. The match had ignited beside a stump where the pulpit once stood. No hand had touched it. No spark was visible. It simply was. He stared as the flame hovered, small and steady, flickering but not dying. He didn't understand what he was witnessing, only that it felt ancient, as if time itself had made room for this moment. He remembered something his grandmother once told him as a boy. Some fires aren't here to burn you, Sam. They're here to call you back to something. At the time, he thought she was being poetic. But now, standing on sacred ashes with a self-lit flame, her words felt prophetic. He crouched beside the match, and next to it, saw something in the dirt. Another object. Metallic. Small. He brushed it free and lifted it. A pendant shaped like the same flame-encircled symbol from the church floor. It had initials etched inside. Not Eli's, but someone else's. SCM. The initials were his. Samuel Anthony Monroe. The realization hit him like thunder. His name. His blood. His lineage. Could it be? Was Reverend Eli Monroe his grandfather? The thought felt absurd, yet the signs were aligning too perfectly to ignore. The silence in his family. The stories left untold. The missing uncle. The badge. The fire. It wasn't coincidence. It was calling. And somehow, Samuel was meant to pick up what Eli had left behind. He drove home in silence, pendant clenched in his hand, the badge now hanging from his rearview mirror like a relic from a forgotten temple. That night, he didn't sleep. Instead, he read through every letter, every scrap, every story he could find about Eli. One detail stood out above all. In each town the preacher visited, someone came forward after his disappearance with a confession, a secret released. As if the fire purified not just the place, but the people. And now, Samuel understood. Eli hadn't just vanished. He had ignited a legacy. One not of sermons, but of reckonings. Of divine confrontation. The badge had found its way to Samuel not by fate, but by design. The next question wasn't where Eli had gone, but whether Samuel was ready to go where his grandfather had already walked, into the places people were too afraid to look, and light the match that would show what was hidden in the dark. The following morning, Samuel returned to the firehouse, the badge in one pocket and the pendant around his neck. Something in his posture had shifted, not just curiosity now, but purpose. He walked differently, with the weight of a man who knew the path ahead would cost him something. He approached the station's old records room, a neglected archive of incident reports, half-burnt photos, and local case files dating back 50 years. Dust danced in the sunlight as he opened the drawer marked cold cases, 1980s. Inside, he found a report dated June of 1983, the day after Eli Monroe vanished. It detailed a small fire behind the church at Marlow Creek, presumed accidental. But one line caught Samuel's attention. No cause determined. Fire originated in the pastor's quarters. No personal items recovered, except scorched cloth and unidentifiable ash patterns. He sat in silence, heart thudding. What cloth? Ash patterns? Why had none of this been publicly released? Determined to know more, Samuel requested access to the county's physical evidence locker. After pulling a few strings with the fire chief, he was granted a temporary viewing window. Inside a plastic case sat a piece of fabric, preserved in a vacuum-sealed sleeve, fragile, nearly dissolved by flame, yet still bearing a faint emblem. It was a partial insignia, a flame enclosed in a circle. That same symbol, again and again. But this time, it wasn't burned in wood or etched into a pendant. It was sewn into the lining of a preacher's coat. Samuel pressed his hand against the glass. For the first time, he didn't feel like he was investigating a mystery. He felt like he was standing inside a prayer, one whispered across decades, buried beneath embers, now awakening beneath his fingertips. Something inside told him that if he followed this trail, he wouldn't just find Eli Monroe. He'd find himself. Because this wasn't just about fire. It was about inheritance. About answering a call you never knew was yours until the flame touches your skin. That night, he returned home and dug out the only photograph he had ever seen of his father. He'd always been told his dad died young, and that there were no real records. But now, looking closely, something clicked. The man in the photo wore a wedding band engraved with 3 letters, Eli Monroe's son. Samuel's father. The connections were no longer threads. They were chains, thick, divine, and unbreakable. This wasn't just his story anymore. It was his bloodline. Haunted by the revelations, Samuel drove to the outskirts of a forgotten town called Ash Hollow, one of the last places Eli had been rumored to visit before his disappearance. The town had aged poorly. Shuttered storefronts, broken windows, a single gas pump with no prices listed. But beneath the surface, something lingered. The kind of silence that didn't mean emptiness, but waiting, as if the land itself was holding its breath. He stopped at a diner that still had power and asked the elderly waitress about the preacher. Her eyes narrowed. "You don't forget a man like that," she said. "He came in one night, ordered black coffee, and asked me how long I'd been hiding the truth. I hadn't told anyone, but somehow he knew." Samuel asked what truth she meant. Her hand trembled as she set down his cup. "My husband had a second family, lived 2 lives. I was too afraid to confront him, but the next day I did. And the day after that, our barn caught fire. The fire hadn't killed anyone," she said. In fact, it had spared everything important, except for the chest where her husband kept all his secrets. Letters, photos, proof, gone, reduced to smoke. But strangely, she didn't weep when telling it. She smiled. "It was like Eli took the burden away before it poisoned me," she said. "He didn't burn things. He released them." Samuel nodded slowly, understanding for the first time what his grandfather truly was, not just a preacher, but a purifier. He left Ash Hollow with a new sense of clarity. Every fire was targeted, every appearance timed. Eli Monroe had moved like a divine storm, called not by men, but by the unseen ache of truth buried too deep to name. And now, that same wind was behind Samuel. He could feel in his chest, rising like breath before a sermon. He wasn't retracing his grandfather's steps anymore. He was continuing them, not just to solve a disappearance, but to finish what had been started. That evening, Samuel sat in front of a blank map. One by one, he marked every town where a fire had followed Eli. The pins connected like a constellation, a path, a pattern, and at the center of it all was a small, forgotten place with no fire on record, no sermon noted. Only a name scribbled once in a sheriff's log. Preacher headed north to Hallow's Edge. Seemed burdened. Samuel stared at the name. It was time to go, not to chase answers, but to step into the flame himself. Hallow's Edge was not on most maps. The road leading to it was cracked and winding, swallowed by overgrowth and time. Samuel arrived as the sun began to fall behind thick trees, casting long shadows over what was once a town square. There were only a few standing buildings, a church with its steeple leaning like a tired sentinel, a general store with no windows, and a single house with lights still flickering through the curtains. As he stepped out of his truck, the air felt different here. Heavy, like a curtain waiting to be pulled back. He walked first toward the church. Its doors were swollen shut, but the wood was warm, almost pulsing, as though it still remembered the hands that had once opened it in faith and fear. Etched into the frame, faded but still visible, was the same symbol, the flame within the circle. Samuel pressed his fingers to it. For a moment, the world fell away. No birds, no wind, just silence that hummed like breath held too long. Then, behind him, a voice. "You've come for him, haven't you?" Samuel turned. An old man stood at the base of the church steps, wearing a coat patched in a dozen places and eyes that seemed older than anything around them. "You're Monroe's kin. I can see it in the fire behind your eyes." Samuel's voice caught in his throat, but he nodded. The man gave a slow, sad smile. "He came here to bury something, but I don't think he ever left." They walked together to the edge of a wooded trail. The man pointed ahead. "He built something here. Said it was the only place left that was untouched by secrets. A place where fire couldn't reach, only spirit." Samuel followed the path as the trees grew thicker and the air more charged. Finally, they reached a clearing, and in its center stood a small cabin, untouched by time, wrapped in vines and reverence. A cross hung over the door, and beneath it, in rusted iron, the initials, E.M. Inside the cabin, dust hung like memory in the air. Everything was intact. Books, candles, a coat still slung over a chair. On the table lay an open journal, its last page written in sharp, steady ink. The truth is not the flame. The truth is what survives it. Samuel ran his hand across the words. He had found where Eli had gone. And more than that, he had found where Eli had chosen to remain. That night, Samuel stayed in the cabin. He lit the old candles, breathed the stillness, and read every page of the journal. It wasn't filled with sermons or scriptures. It was filled with names, dozens of them, each one accompanied by a short note, a secret confessed, a burden lifted, a fire that followed. Some entries ended with forgiveness, others with silence. But all of them ended with a date and a place. It was Eli's map of redemption, his true ministry, not just preaching, but witnessing transformation by fire. Samuel wept as he read the final entry. It spoke of a vision, of a man who would come long after, who carried the same burden in his blood, and would find the badge when it was time. He will not know at first, but he will burn brighter than I ever dared. He will be the answer to the questions I could never ask aloud. Samuel closed the book slowly. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from the overwhelming clarity of knowing. He was not lost. He was chosen. The next morning, Samuel stepped outside and found the old man waiting at the edge of the woods. He said nothing at first, only studied Samuel's face. Then he nodded. I kept it safe all these years, he said, reaching into his coat and pulling out a box. Inside was Eli's second pendant, a twin to the one Samuel had found, but unburned, whole. He told me to give this to the one who heard the fire before he saw it. Samuel took the pendant, feeling its warmth spread through his chest like sunlight on winter skin. He walked back to the church and, with a heavy shoulder, pushed the doors open. Inside, the sanctuary stood frozen in time. Pews cracked, altar faded, and a broken Bible resting open on the pulpit. The pages were blank. Samuel stepped forward, placed the pendant at its center, and whispered a prayer not written in scripture, but carved from soul. Let the truth burn what it must. Let only what's real remain. And as he did, the room filled with the faint scent of smoke, not choking, but sweet, like incense after a blessing. As he stepped out of the church, the sky had turned golden. A light breeze stirred the trees, and for the first time, Samuel didn't feel like he was searching. He was ready to walk the same road, ready to speak what others feared, ready to set fires, not to destroy, but to free. Because Eli Monroe had never truly vanished. His flame had simply passed on, waiting for someone to carry it forward. Samuel returned home with a new fire in his heart. Not reckless, not wild, but resolute. He no longer felt like an outsider searching for fragments. He was now the keeper of a story, of a mission, of a legacy forged in ash and redeemed through truth. The first thing he did was clear a room in his home and turn it into a sanctuary, a place to think, to write, to remember. On the wall, he hung the badge, the journal, and the two pendants, forming a triangle of symbols. Beneath them, he wrote 4 words on a canvas. Light only what saves. He began retracing Eli's steps, not through archives alone, but through people, descendants, witnesses, those whose names had appeared in the journal. Each one had a memory, a tale, a scar. A woman in Derry who confessed she had once hidden her brother's crime. A man in Oak Ridge who admitted to driving away his wife in shame and silence. None of them had seen Eli again, but all of them, to Samuel's amazement, remembered the same thing. After the preacher's visit, something burned. And afterward, something broke free. What struck Samuel most wasn't the destruction, but the pattern. Fire had come not to punish, but to release. As if Eli had seen the fire as a form of divine mercy, a way to strip away lies that shackled the soul. And now Samuel began to see signs where others saw ruins. In a collapsed barn, he noticed the foundation had remained firm while the roof, built on greed, had rotted. In an abandoned home, the only thing untouched was a photograph, a mother holding a child, smiling through sorrow. The flame knew where to go, but not everyone welcomed his presence. In a small town called Grenton, Samuel asked about a fire from the mid-1980s. The local sheriff, old and bitter, shut him down immediately. "You're stirring up ghosts," he growled. "Let 'em lie. That preacher brought nothing but fire and fear." But when Samuel pressed further, the man's eyes flickered. not with anger, but with guilt. And Samuel realized that wherever Eli had gone, he had unearthed more than sin. He had exposed the cost of silence. That night, back in his truck, Samuel whispered to the badge, the pendant, the wind itself, "I'm not here to accuse. I'm here to listen." The breeze shifted. A single leaf lifted from the dashboard and settled on his lap. It had a faint scorch mark, fresh, despite the windows being closed. He didn't flinch. He smiled. Eli was still with him, not in body, but in flame, guiding, igniting, revealing. And Samuel, now more than ever, was ready to go where the fire led. As word spread of Samuel's journey, people began to reach out. Letters arrived with trembling handwriting, emails with subject lines like, "I think I saw him once," or "There was a fire after he came." One message stood out. A woman named Helen from a village called Edenbrook. She claimed she had something of Eli's, something he left behind intentionally. Her tone was calm, almost sacred. Samuel wasted no time. He packed his things and headed toward Edenbrook, not knowing what he'd find, but certain it would matter. Helen's home was modest, surrounded by weeping willows and silence. She greeted Samuel with eyes full of memory. "You walk like him," she said. "Slow, certain, as if the ground already told you where to go." She invited him in and led him to a chest covered in dust. Inside, wrapped in cloth, was a music box. Samuel's breath caught. He remembered the journal, an entry about a melody Eli would hum when words failed him, a tune of hope, of cleansing, of light breaking through. Helen turned the key. The box played a soft, haunting lullaby, unlike anything Samuel had heard. Then she said something that made his heart stop. "He told me, if someone came and listened without interrupting, truly listened, that he'd know the journey had begun again." Tears welled in Samuel's eyes. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The melody filled the room like a warm fog, and in that moment, it felt as though Eli himself was standing between them, smiling. She handed the box to Samuel. He said, "Fire tells the truth, but music heals the wounds it leaves behind. You'll need both." Samuel held it gently, reverently. It wasn't just a gift. It was a mantle, a symbol of balance, to carry the flame and the song, to confront and to comfort, to be the storm and the stillness afterward. That night, in a room lit only by candlelight, he played the melody over and over, letting it wrap around the silence until even the shadows dared not interrupt. He began writing his own journal, not to replace Eli's, but to continue it. Every town, every truth, every fire, both literal and figurative. He recorded it all, because stories like flames need oxygen, and the more they're hidden, the colder the world becomes. Samuel wasn't just chasing the past anymore. He was becoming its echo, its voice, its keeper. And far ahead, though faint, he could already see the next flicker, a town not yet on his map, but already on fire inside his soul. The next town Samuel visited was Crestford, a place that hadn't known a church service in over 2 decades. The sanctuary had been closed after a mysterious fire in 1989, and no one had rebuilt it. Locals believed the ground itself had been cursed, though no one could agree on what had caused the blaze. Samuel walked through the ruins slowly, boots crunching over blackened wood and moss-covered stones. What remained was haunting, not destruction, but an invitation, as if something sacred had once passed through, leaving only the shell behind. In the center of what used to be the altar, he found a pile of stone arranged in a deliberate shape, a circle within a square. Beneath the rocks was a rusted key, wrapped in cloth that had miraculously survived time and flame. Samuel unfolded it with trembling fingers. Sewn into the fabric, barely visible, were the words, "Unlock only if you believe." He didn't know what the key opened, but he knew it wasn't a door made of wood or steel. It was meant for something buried, something within. He stayed the night in Crestford, renting a room in a weathered inn that hadn't hosted a traveler in months. That evening, a knock came to the door. An old woman stood outside, holding a candle. "You have his eyes," she said, "and you walk like fire doesn't scare you." She invited herself in without waiting. "I saw him once. He stood right where your boots stand now, and said something I never forgot. He told me, some prayers don't need to be spoken. They just need to burn." Then she left, as quietly as she had come. Samuel couldn't sleep that night. He lay in bed, holding the key, the fabric still warm, as if it remembered hands older than his. He thought about all the places he'd been, all the people still carrying wounds like sealed jars of smoke, suffocating, but hidden. He understood now that Eli's fires weren't destruction. They were answers to questions no one dared ask aloud. And maybe the key wasn't meant to open anything physical. Maybe it was meant to remind him. Belief itself unlocks what fire cannot. When morning came, the light over Crestford looked different, as if something had been lifted. The ruins no longer looked tragic. They looked cleansed. Samuel placed the cloth and key back beneath the stones, adding his own note in return. He came through me too. It wasn't a goodbye. It was a continuation. As he drove away, he glanced at the rearview mirror. For just a second, standing where the altar once was, he thought he saw a figure in white, unmoving, watching. Then it was gone. The next trail led Samuel west, to a place known only in whispers, Ember's Rest. It wasn't on any map, yet he had heard it mentioned 3 times by 3 different people, all strangers, all unaware of each other. That alone told him it mattered. As he drove through canyons and old mining roads, the landscape shifted. The trees grew denser, the sky darker, the air thick with something unspoken. When he finally arrived, the sign at the town's edge was nearly swallowed by vines. Welcome to Ember's Rest. Come for the peace. Stay for the truth. He parked his truck beside an abandoned chapel with scorched siding and broken windows. The building felt alive, humming with dormant energy. Inside, pews were scattered, some upside down, others charred. But at the pulpit, untouched, was a box made of dark cedar. Samuel approached slowly, heart pounding, as if something, or someone, waited for him to arrive. The lid was engraved with a phrase that echoed what Eli had once written: "Flame doesn't end things. It reveals who stayed standing." Inside the box were dozens of items: a child's drawing, a burned photograph, a silver ring melted into a heart shape, and a letter, yellowed, brittle but intact. It was addressed to the one who carries the fire. Samuel opened it, hands shaking. The letter told of a great secret, that Ember's Rest had once been a place where Eli brought those who couldn't confess their truths to the world. Here, he burned not what they said, but what they feared to say. And after the fire, they left different, not lighter, but whole. Reading the letter felt like hearing Eli speak. He wrote of pain that doesn't scream, only simmers, generational, spiritual, buried under rituals and silence, and of the need for someone to keep walking the path when he could not. If you're reading this, the letter concluded, then the flame chose you. You are not here to finish what I started. You are here because fire never ends. It only waits for more hands to hold it. Samuel folded the letter slowly, tears falling freely down his cheeks. As he stepped outside, the wind picked up and scattered leaves across the chapel floor. One caught fire, small, golden, delicate, and vanished into the air. No smoke, no ash, just light. Samuel looked up, no longer seeking signs. He was the sign now. He didn't need to wonder if he was on the right path. The path had already been written, in flame, in music, in silence. And he was walking it exactly as he was meant to. The further west Samuel went, the more elusive the road became. He was no longer following a map. He was following memory. Whispers turned into landmarks, and silence became direction. He stopped in a town called Grayston, once thriving, now almost abandoned. A single diner remained open, where he met a man named Davis, a former paramedic with pale eyes and a voice that sounded like gravel. Davis listened quietly as Samuel shared Eli's name. Then he said something that made the entire room still. "He saved my life, but no one believes me." Davis recalled a night in 1983 when a child had been trapped inside a burning house. Davis, young and reckless, had charged in without backup. Inside, the flames grew too fast. He remembered falling, gasping, almost certain it was over. And then a hand, strong, steady, pulling him through a back exit no one even knew existed. Outside, in the smoke, a man with deep-set eyes whispered, "Some fires are tests. Others are calls. Yours was both." Then the man disappeared into shadows. Samuel asked if he had anything, a token, a detail, Davis reached into a box and pulled out a broken watch. It wasn't mine. It was his. He gave it to me before he vanished. Said, "This doesn't measure hours. It measures chances." I never understood it. Until now. The watch still ticked, though it had no hands. Samuel turned in his palm, feeling weight not just of metal, but of meaning. Another piece of Eli's puzzle had surfaced, not to explain him, but to witness him. That night, Samuel slept in his truck near an old grain silo. Dreams came heavy, filled with ash, light, and voices humming the melody from the music box. One voice rose above the others, Eli's. Do not rescue. Reveal. Do not burn what's broken. Burn what pretends to be whole. Samuel awoke with a start, heart racing, the morning sun already kissing the horizon. He took it as a sign. Grayston had given him clarity. Eli didn't set fires to destroy. He lit them to unmask. Before leaving, Davis gave Samuel a final warning. Not everyone wants the truth revealed. Some of those fires weren't accidents. Some were lit to stop him. If you're carrying his flame, be careful. You're not just following a preacher. You're walking through the lies people killed to protect. Samuel nodded. He wasn't afraid. But he now understood. Eli's disappearance wasn't a mystery. It was a threat to someone. And Samuel had just stepped into its center. Samuel drove through the early light, the broken watch ticking beside him, steady as a heartbeat. His next destination wasn't found in any clue, but in a name that kept echoing through the letters he'd collected. Hollow Bend. Every time he heard it, it came with hesitation, as if those who spoke it weren't afraid of the place itself, but of what remained there. The moment he crossed into the valley, he felt it, an atmosphere too still, too quiet, like grief that had forgotten how to cry. The town was empty, not abandoned but paused. Curtains moved. Footsteps echoed behind closed doors. Yet no one came out. Samuel walked toward the church, now reduced to its stone foundation and a crooked bell tower that leaned like a secret. There, carved into the wood beneath the tower, were 3 initials, EMS, Eli Monroe Shepard. Beneath them, a date, July 3rd, 1983, the day he vanished. This wasn't coincidence. This was the place. He entered the remnants of the church and found nothing at first, just wind, dust, and cracked hymnals. But as he approached the altar, a soft creaking sound broke the silence. The floor beneath him dipped. Carefully, he pried back the floorboards and uncovered a narrow staircase, hidden for decades. At the bottom was a room lined with scorched pages. Prayers, confessions, names, some legible, others melted by flame. In the center of the room sat a lantern, unlit but full of oil, and beside it, a photograph of Eli smiling. Samuel lit the lantern. Instantly, the room came alive with warmth and golden light. The pages on the walls seemed to shift, words shimmering where before there was only soot. And then, he heard it, a faint hum, the melody from a music box. It wasn't in his head. It filled the air like a heartbeat. He turned, half expecting to see someone. But there was only light. And yet, he wasn't alone. In that moment, Samuel felt it fully. Eli had been here. This had been his last sanctuary, and possibly his last warning. The message was clear. Truth buried will always try to rise. And sometimes, it needs fire to be seen. Samuel sat in the glow, letting the warmth surround him, letting the fear dissolve. He wasn't just following Eli anymore. He was stepping into his path, becoming what the preacher had once been. Not a man with answers, but a man who carried light into the places people feared to look. And Hollow Bend had just lit the way to what came next. Samuel remained in Hollow Bend until nightfall, listening to the lantern's soft crackle and the echo of that haunting melody. He knew now that Eli had been hunted, not for what he had done, but for what he had dared to illuminate. This wasn't just a preacher's journey. It was a rebellion against darkness disguised as righteousness. Before he left the hidden room, Samuel gently folded the photograph of Eli and tucked it into his journal, as if carrying a torch passed hand to hand through decades. As he returned to the surface, he noticed something etched on the inside of the bell tower. It had been hidden from plain sight unless viewed in a certain slant of light. He who burns for truth cannot be buried in silence. The line hit Samuel like thunder. Eli had carved his own epitaph long before his disappearance. And it wasn't a farewell, it was a defiance. A declaration that even death would not silence the flame of truth. Driving out Hollow Bend, the road felt unfamiliar, almost reluctant to let him go. Samuel had the sense he had stepped through a veil, one where faith and fear, memory and mystery, blurred into something higher. The lantern now rode in the back seat, still warm, though unlit. It was as if the light inside it didn't need flame anymore. It had found a new vessel. That night, he stopped at a roadside chapel that was still active, its pews filled with weary souls seeking comfort. Samuel didn't speak, didn't introduce himself. He simply sat and listened. The preacher was young and nervous, stumbling over words. But when he said, "Sometimes the fire you run from is the one that saves you," Samuel sat up straight. That line, it was Eli's. Not a quote from Scripture, something Eli had said in a letter found in Ember's Rest. After the service, Samuel approached the preacher. "Where did you hear that line?" he asked. The young man blinked, confused. "I don't know. I've just always felt it." And in that moment, Samuel understood. Eli's message had outlived his body. It had become part of the wind, the voices, the stories. This wasn't a trail of ashes. It was a network of embers, carried by strangers, reigniting without them even knowing. The fire was alive. The next morning brought an unexpected detour. Samuel's truck overheated outside a rural mechanic's shop surrounded by cornfields. While waiting for repairs, he sat in the shade and was joined by a woman in her 60s, wearing denim overalls and an oil-stained cap. Her name was Irene. She offered him lemonade and listened quietly as he mentioned Eli's name. Her eyes didn't widen. They softened. "He came through here," she said simply, "right before he vanished. Fixed my husband's truck, but left more than tools behind." Irene led Samuel behind the shop, to a storage shed nearly swallowed by vines. Inside, beneath old tarps and boxes, was a chalkboard, faded but legible. Written on it, dozens of names. "He called them people of the second fire," she said. "Folks who had burned once in life, loss, betrayal, grief, but were learning to burn again, this time by choice. To carry light, to stop hiding." She paused, then added, "He told me I was one of them." Samuel traced the chalk with his fingertips. The last name on the board was a child's, Milo Barnes. Irene told him Milo had been mute since a fire took his parents. Eli had visited the boy every day for a week, never asking him to speak, just listening. On the final day, Milo placed a pebble in Eli's hand and whispered, "You don't burn me." Those were his first words in years. Eli smiled, then left. Milo spoke freely ever since. "He never forced healing," Irene said. "He invited it." Before leaving, Irene handed Samuel a small object wrapped in cloth. It was a sliver of stained glass, purple and red, smooth as water. "He told me it was from a window he broke once," she said. "Said the church wanted it whole, but he wanted it true. I've kept it ever since." Samuel held the glass to the sunlight. It refracted the light into flame-colored beams across the wall. The fire wasn't just symbolic. It was tangible, meant to be passed on. As Samuel drove away, the sliver of glass rested on the dashboard, catching the sun and bending it like a prism. He realized that Eli's story wasn't fragmented. It was mosaic, built piece by piece from those he'd touched. Each name on the chalkboard, each hidden room, each melody, each letter, it all told one story. Truth that burns isn't destructive. It's divine. And Samuel was no longer following it. He was now part of it. Samuel's next destination was unexpected, a hospital in New Hampshire that had been closed for overdue as decadus. He had found a torn page in Eli's journal mentioning St. Meredith's, room 213. When he arrived, the building stood in eerie silence, surrounded by overgrown ivy and shattered windows. The front doors creaked open as if still expecting visitors. The air inside was stale but charged, as though the walls had not forgotten the stories whispered in its halls. He climbed the stairwell slowly, passing by rusted stretchers and peeling paint. Room Zintozi trees sat at the end of the corridor, door ajar. Inside, the room was untouched. A bed with folded sheets, a Bible on the windowsill, and a single chair beside the bed. On the wall was a message scratched in a plaster. "Don't be afraid of the fire. Be afraid of forgetting why you lit it. The signature below was faint but visible. E.M. Samuel found a cassette player tucked beneath the bed with a label marked July 1983. When he pressed play, a voice filled the room. It was Eli. Calm, firm, unmistakable. He spoke not to a congregation, but to someone broken. The fire in you is not your punishment. It is your purpose. You carry it not to burn others, but to light the way for those still afraid of the dark. The tape continued with verses, but also names, stories, many that Samuel recognized from the journal. By the end of the recording, Samuel was sitting on the floor, tears streaming down his face. He realized this room had been more than a place of healing. It had been a confessional for the forgotten. Eli had spent time here, tending not to sickness of the body, but wounds of the spirit. The hospital had closed, but the echoes remained. And now, Samuel carried them forward. Each story, each voice, each ember reignited. He took the cassette, the Bible, and the chair, small relics of Eli's silent revolution. As he exited, the morning sun poured through the broken windows, casting golden light across the dust. It no longer felt like decay. It felt sacred. Eli had left no monument, no statue, no plaque. But in places like St. Meredith's, his presence was stronger than stone. And Samuel knew, with absolute certainty, that his next step would lead him deeper into the fire. Back on the road, Samuel followed a lead to an elderly woman named Clara Henson, who once worked as a music teacher in a small Tennessee town. Locals refer to her as the woman who sang with ghosts. When Samuel arrived at her modest cottage, Clara greeted him as if she had been expecting him. "You're the boy with the badge and the fire in his voice," she said, smiling through cataract-fogged eyes. "Eli said you'd come. Said you'd ask about the song." Clara invited him in and led him to a dusty piano covered with sheets of handwritten music. "He came to me after midnight," she said. "Didn't say his name. Just asked if I knew what music sounded like after grief. Then he hummed a melody I'd never heard before, but I've played it every week since." Samuel sat beside her as she played. It was the melody, the same from a music box, from the journal, from Hollow Bend. It was alive in her fingers. As the final note echoed into silence, Clara leaned closer and whispered, "That's not just a song. That's his voice. He said music is how we speak to heaven when words fail. And this song is a message waiting for someone brave enough to listen." She handed Samuel a worn envelope sealed with wax. Inside was a torn manuscript labeled, "The Song of Firekeepers," written in Eli's own hand. Lyrics composed not of rhyme, but of testimony. Clara placed her hand over Samuel's. "He wasn't trying to be remembered," she said. "He was trying to remind us that the truth isn't loud. It's persistent. It hums. It waits. It survives even when forgotten." Samuel clutched the envelope, overwhelmed by the gravity of the moment. Every stop along his journey wasn't a discovery. It was a rediscovery of a man who never needed fame to become immortal. As Samuel left Clara's home, the sky turned a deep shade of lavender, stars beginning to emerge. He played the melody on a small recorder as he drove, letting it fill the night. It was no longer just a song. It was a summons, a flame carried through sound, memory, and love. And Samuel understood now. He wasn't following echoes. He was preparing to speak, to sing, to burn for something greater than himself. The road led Samuel to an isolated church surrounded by pine forest, known only to locals as the Hollow Cross. It hadn't hosted a sermon in over Quinzanos, but its bells still rang every Sunday at sunrise, automatically, as if the building itself refused to forget its purpose. Samuel stepped inside and was immediately overwhelmed by the scent of pine, dust, and old candle wax. The pews remained aligned, but worn, as though waiting patiently for a congregation that never returned. Behind the altar, he found a hidden compartment carved into the stone. Inside was a single item, a torn cloak. Not just any cloak, a preacher's cloak. The inner lining held embroidery, nearly faded from time, with a single line intact. He walked alone so others didn't have to. Samuel held it to his chest, breath caught in his throat. There was no name, but there was no need. This was Eli's, abandoned not in defeat, but as a final gesture. On a back wall was a mural, chipped but unmistakable. It depicted a man surrounded by flames, arms open, not in fear, but in invitation. His face was worn away with time, but the shape of his stance mirrored Eli's. At the base of the mural, painted in faded red, were the words, "Do not search for the fire starter. Become the flame." Samuel sank to his knees before it, overcome by the realization that this was never about finding Eli's body. It was about continuing his mission. Suddenly, the bell above rang out, not waiting for Sunday. The sound reverberated through the forest like a call. As it echoed, animals stirred in the trees, the wind picked up, and the sun broke through the clouds. It felt alive, like Eli's spirit had just moved through the space, blessing Samuel's presence and affirming that his time as a seeker was ending. Now, he had to choose. Would he remain a follower of flame, or become its bearer? Samuel lit a candle and placed it in the center of the altar. It burned silently, casting soft light over the empty pews. And yet, it felt like the room was full. He could almost hear voices rising in harmony with the melody Clara had played. This wasn't an end. This was a threshold, a sacred transition. Samuel had found every clue, heard every whisper. Now, the fire waited for his voice, his step, his sermon. The story was ready for its next chapter. In the final leg of his journey, Samuel returned to where it all began, the bridge outside Ember's Rest, where the firefighter had found Eli's badge trace decades before. The river below was calm, golden with the setting sun. Samuel stood at the edge, badge in one hand, music box in the other. He opened it once more. The melody played, slower now, as if aware that the journey had come full circle. But this time, something new emerged. A faint voice, Eli's, singing. It wasn't loud. It wasn't complete. Just a single line, as fragile as smoke. Even in ash, there is song. Samuel clutched the box to his chest. Every stop, every item, every soul Eli had touched, they all pointed not to an answer, but to an understanding. Eli never wanted to be found. He wanted to be followed, and not in footsteps, but in purpose. Samuel was no longer searching. He was becoming. He lit a small fire by the riverside and sat in silence, feeding the flame with pages from his own journal. Not out of despair, but as offering. The stories no longer needed to be chased. They needed to be released. As smoke curled into the twilight sky, Samuel whispered a final prayer. Not for Eli, but for those yet to come. May they carry light, not fear. May they burn for truth, not vengeance. May they walk into darkness, not to conquer it, but to illuminate it. The fire crackled, the music box slowed to a stop, and the river shimmered with reflected flame. In that moment, Samuel felt no grief, only gratitude for the man who had vanished, for the voices who had guided him, for the journey that broke and rebuilt him. He understood now. Some vanishings are not losses. They are seeds, and Eli's had grown into a forest of firekeepers, ready to rise. As he stood and walked away from the flame, he didn't look back. The fire didn't need watching. It needed spreading. And somewhere, in a town forgotten by maps, or a church buried in time, another soul would find Eli's melody. Another hand would pass the light, and the fire would continue, quiet, stubborn, eternal. Days later, Samuel received an anonymous envelope delivered to his motel room in the early hours. Inside was a single Polaroid photo, faded but unmistakable. It showed a campfire in a clearing, with silhouettes surrounding it. At the center stood a man with his hand raised, caught mid-speech. The man's face was turned, but the posture, steady, open, humble, echoed everything Samuel had come to associate with Eli. On the back, a date, October 4th, 1986. 3 years after Eli's disappearance. He stared at the photo, heart pounding. Eli had lived. Beyond the headlines, beyond the timeline. He had walked among those who needed him, unseen. It wasn't proof of survival. It was proof of choice. Eli had chosen to disappear, not to escape, but to reach further. And whoever sent the photo, they knew. Samuel now stood at a threshold few ever approached, the space between myth and man, the echo that follows a fire too bright to watch directly. Determined, Samuel drove for hours through winding roads and deep forest, until he reached the spot marked on the back of the envelope. It was a clearing just like the one in the photo. Charred stones formed a broken ring in the soil. Trees encircled the space like witnesses. And in the center, he found something buried beneath a pile of ash. A smooth stone, engraved with one phrase, "This is not the end." Samuel knelt before it, overwhelmed by reverence, and placed his hand upon the stone. The wind picked up gently, rustling the leaves in a rhythmic hush, as if the forest were singing. Samuel knew that Eli might never return in flesh, but he had returned in voice, in symbol, in the living tapestry of lives changed. And maybe that was always the point, to shift from being one fire to igniting many. Eli was not missing. He had become movement, and that movement had reached Samuel like it had reached Clara, Irene, Milo, and so many others who never appear in headlines. As Samuel prepared to leave the clearing, he left behind his own badge next to the stone, not in surrender, but in continuation. The world didn't need another searcher. It needed keepers, protectors of truth, of light, of stories too powerful to remain buried. And Samuel, once a follower of trails, now became their guardian. In that sacred forest, he did not say goodbye. He simply walked forward, eyes open, heart lit. Back in Ember's Rest, the town had started to change. Samuel noticed subtle shifts. An old church being repainted, a community center reopening, teenagers playing guitar on street corners. Places once silenced by grief, now hummed with life. And everywhere he went, he heard snippets of the melody, played on pianos, hummed under breath, even used as a ringtone. Eli's song had taken root, not as legend, but as language, a new dialect of healing. At a small local school, Samuel was invited to speak. He stood in front of a class of restless children and told a story, not of disappearance, but of fire, of how light can be hidden but never extinguished, of how one man's quiet walk through forgotten places had ignited a movement that outlived memory. The children didn't fidget. They didn't yawn. They listened, wide-eyed, as if hearing a myth they instinctively knew was true. Afterward, a boy approached him holding a crumpled note. "I found this in my grandpa's drawer," he said. Samuel unfolded it and felt his throat tighten. It was a sermon, handwritten in Eli's looping script. The date matched the year of the photo. The final line read, "If one child hears this, the fire will spread again." Samuel looked down at the boy, realizing that the fire had already leapt, quietly, faithfully, without ceremony. That evening, Samuel returned to the bell tower in Hollow Bend. He climbed the steps alone, the same way Eli once had. From the top, the valley stretched into shadow and gold. He placed a lantern on the ledge, not to be seen, but to see. The flame within it burned softly, not demanding attention, but offering it. Below, wind stirred the trees, and in the hush, Samuel heard something that didn't come from memory or fear. It was peace. He sat in silence, the lantern at his side, and allowed the moment to exist without explanation. He had not found a missing man. He had uncovered a hidden truth, that sometimes the greatest presence is one that never returns the same way twice. That disappearance is not always absence. That fire, once lit in the right heart, continues without permission or applause. And in that quiet tower, Samuel smiled. Because he wasn't alone. He was exactly where the flame had always led. Weeks passed. Samuel had stopped chasing trails and had started listening to stories. People came to him now, not with questions, but with confessions. An old veteran spoke of a night in '85 when a stranger shared half his bread and quoted scripture that burned like truth. A mother recalled a prayer she'd heard sung in a shelter, the same melody Samuel had come to recognize as Eli's. These were not sightings, they were echoes, and each one formed another thread in the invisible tapestry Eli had woven across decades. One day, a woman approached him with a tattered photo of her younger self standing next to a preacher. He said nothing at all. She whispered, "Just handed me a Bible," and smiled like he knew the storm would pass. Her hand trembled as she handed Samuel the Bible. Inside was a name, faint but legible, Eli Marchand. It had been passed from person to person over 20 years, each page holding the fingerprints of the broken, the healed, and the hopeful. Samuel spent his nights copying the pages of Eli's journal into new notebooks, leaving them anonymously in hospitals, shelters, even libraries. He had become not the keeper of a story, but the distributor of it. His mission was no longer to prove Eli existed. It was to ensure no one forgot why he had. And as more people read the words, sang the melody, or whispered the phrases carved into old chapel stones, something remarkable began to unfold. Communities once fractured began holding candlelit gatherings. Not religious services, not protests, simply spaces of remembrance, where grief could speak and silence could heal. Samuel watched as a woman who had never met Eli read one of his journal entries aloud and wept as if hearing her own father. The fire had done more than spread. It had transformed. It had turned memory into ministry. And perhaps that was always Eli's plan, to never be larger than life, but to be small enough to fit inside it. In whispered songs, in handwritten notes, in the small, sacred exchanges between strangers, Samuel finally understood. Legacy is not built in fame. It's built in how we choose to carry light when no one is watching. One morning, as Samuel walked through a quiet park, he came across a little girl playing with a music box. The tune was unmistakable, the same haunting melody he had followed across cities, forests, and ruins. He knelt beside her and asked where she had found it. "It was my mom's," she said. "She said a kind man gave it to her when she was sad. Told her it was a song for people who forgot how to hope." Samuel sat with her in silence, listening as the notes spilled into the wind. For a moment, time dissolved. There were no dates, no disappearances, only the presence of a sound that refused to die. The girl looked up and smiled. "It sounds like someone saying everything's going to be okay." Samuel nodded slowly. "That's because someone is." And though he didn't say Eli's name, he felt his presence more than ever. Later that day, he visited the firefighter who had found the badge 34 years ago. The man, now retired, welcomed Samuel like an old friend. "Never thought anyone would care about that story," he chuckled. "But it's funny. After I found the badge, I started leaving a lantern by the station door every night. Don't know why. Just felt like someone out there might need to see a light." Samuel smiled. The fire had reached more people than anyone had realized. They sat by the fire pit in his backyard, the badge lying between them like a shared memory. Samuel didn't ask for details. He didn't need to. What mattered was not what Eli had done, but what others had done because of him. The legacy wasn't in his disappearance. It was in every act of quiet defiance, of chosen kindness, of unexplainable hope. Eli had become a question answered not by words, but by lives. As the sun dipped below the trees and the fire crackled into the night, Samuel felt a peace he hadn't known before. There were still no final answers, no grand revelations, just a path that continued forward, lit by the choices of ordinary people choosing to carry something extraordinary. And that was enough. On the anniversary of Eli's disappearance, Samuel returned to the place where it all began, the abandoned chapel on the outskirts of Ember's Rest. The wooden door still creaked the same way, and sunlight pierced through the broken stained glass, casting soft fragments of color on the dusty pews. But this time, he wasn't alone. Dozens of people stood silently inside, many of them strangers to one another, but all connected by stories they had either lived or heard. A woman in the back held a photo of her father, once a drunkard, now a pastor, who claimed he'd been helped by a nameless preacher decades ago. A man whispered that a stranger had handed him his first Bible on the edge of a bridge. A teenager said she'd found a note in a secondhand book with the words, "Keep walking. Even embers can light the world." Each voice was a thread, and the chapel became a tapestry. Eli was not a ghost. He was a presence, in story, in memory, in every act of compassion that refused to die. Samuel stepped forward and placed the music box at the altar. It no longer played perfectly. Some notes faltered, others faded, but somehow that made it more sacred. As the melody danced through the air, people began to hum along. Some cried, some simply closed their eyes. And in that imperfect harmony, the most profound truth revealed itself. You don't have to be whole to shine. Even the broken carry the flame. A child stepped forward and asked if Eli was ever found. Samuel knelt and looked him in the eyes. "He found us," he answered softly. "And that's what matters." The child smiled, and lit a small candle, placing it beside the music box. One by one, others followed, until the altar blazed not with fire, but with light passed hand to hand, heart to heart. It was no longer just about remembering. It was about continuing. And as the final flame was lit, Samuel realized this wasn't closure. It was continuation. The story of a man who vanished had become the story of people who awakened, of light passed without fame, of songs sung without credit, of lives touched without being named. And in that, Eli lived, not in a body, but in a burning that would never be extinguished. In the weeks that followed, the town of Ember's Rest quietly changed, not through renovation or revival, but through something deeper, something rooted. People left lanterns in their windows. Children sang unfamiliar melodies at bedtime. Strangers nodded to one another with the soft reverence usually reserved for sacred places. It wasn't a movement. It was a memory, alive and contagious. Samuel began receiving letters, some typed, some handwritten, each with stories of encounters that defied logic but felt utterly real. A man who survived a fire swore someone dragged him out, only to vanish in the smoke. A woman who had lost her husband dreamed of a preacher handing her a music box. A child on the edge of giving up found a notebook under his pillow with verses that weren't in any Bible. No sender ever claimed them, but Samuel didn't need names. He recognized the pattern. He created a small archive, not for evidence, but for legacy. Every page, every object, every whisper was a flame, not to be preserved in glass, but to be passed. He taught local teens how to listen, how to share, how to recognize when a story wasn't just strange, but sacred. And in doing so, he became more than a seeker. He became what Eli had always been, a quiet guide on an unseen path. On a cold morning, as fog blanketed the town, Samuel walked the length of the river and placed a new music box beneath the bridge. It wasn't hidden. It wasn't buried. It was waiting for whoever needed it next. The melody was the same, but the message had evolved. Not find the preacher, but be the light. He didn't turn back after placing it. He simply walked on, because the story was no longer his to carry alone. And somewhere, in the hush of morning, a child would find it, would listen, would feel less alone, and maybe, just maybe, would take the first step toward becoming flame. Not because someone told them to, but because something ancient and quiet within them whispered, "You are not lost. You are becoming." Months later, in a nearby city, a homeless man named Ray sat on the steps of a crumbling church, his hands trembling from cold and hunger. Beside him lay a worn coat that didn't fit and a broken guitar missing 3 strings. He was used to silence, used to being invisible. But that day, someone walked by and left a small, simple object in his lap, a music box. Confused, Ray turned the key and let it play. The melody was soft, haunting, and for some reason, it made him cry. The tears came not from sadness, but from recognition, as if someone had remembered him, seen him, loved him through time and distance. He didn't know why, but that song made him sit up straighter, made him pick up his guitar, even if he could only play half a song. And people stopped. They listened. A woman offered him food. A child hugged him. That night, Ray didn't sleep alone. He slept with hope wrapped around him like a blanket. The next morning, Ray left the music box on a bench with a note. "If you're hearing this, you're not forgotten." And so, the melody moved again, this time from his hands to another's. It wasn't just a song anymore. It was a network, a quiet revolution of tenderness, of strangers saying to one another, "You matter," without speaking a word. The flame hadn't dimmed. It had multiplied. Back in Ember's Rest, Samuel heard about the man in the city. He smiled to himself, not out of pride, but understanding. The fire was working. The light was traveling. And he didn't need to know every hand that carried it, just that it was being carried. That was the mission now. Not to preserve Eli's legacy in stone, but to let it live in motion. In footsteps, in ripples that would never be traced to a single source. Samuel visited the chapel again that week. It had no sign, no cross, no grand stained glass, but it had warmth. People gathered not to worship, but to remember. They brought stories, music, candles. Some left quietly in tears. Others laughed over coffee in the back pews. It wasn't a church. It was a hearth, and as long as the fire burned there, Eli had not vanished. He had expanded. Years passed. Samuel aged, but never stopped walking. His hair grayed, his hands shook, but his eyes remained lit. He no longer needed to search for Eli. He saw him everywhere. In the teacher who let a hungry student sleep in class. In the bus driver who left free lunches on the seat. In the young girl who sang a forgotten melody during recess and made everyone pause. Eli was no longer a person to be found. He had become a spirit to be followed. One winter evening, as snow began to fall, Samuel sat by his window and watched the world turn silver and still. A knock at the door broke the quiet. A child stood there, holding a notebook. "My mom said you'd know what this is," she said. Samuel opened it slowly and recognized the handwriting immediately. Not Eli's, but his own from decades ago. One of the first journals he had copied and released into the world. The child's mother had found it during a dark chapter and passed it on. He invited her in, made her tea, and asked what she had learned. She didn't quote a verse or sing the melody. She simply said, "He made me believe I could survive." Samuel closed his eyes, tears forming, not from sadness, but fulfillment. The chain had never broken. It had only grown longer, stronger, more human. And in that moment, he knew the story was complete not because it ended, but because it continued without needing to be explained. That night, he returned to the chapel once more. He brought with him a small wooden box containing everything he had left: photos, copies, the original music box, and a candle. He placed it in the center of the altar and lit the flame one final time, not to signal the end, but to signal enough. The torch had been passed, and whoever found it next would carry it further than he ever could. And as the flame flickered in the quiet chapel, Samuel sat in silence, surrounded by shadows and echoes and warmth. He whispered a final thank you, not to Eli, but to everyone who had listened, who had believed, who had become the next note in the melody. Because in the end, the badge didn't matter. The vanishing didn't matter. Only the light did, and it was still burning. Years had woven themselves into the fabric of Samuel's life, but the fire within never dimmed. He found himself at the edge of a small town called Willow's Hollow, a place that whispered stories through its rustling leaves and winding streets. Here, Eli had once preached beneath an ancient oak, promising light to those who carried shadows. Samuel stood beneath the sprawling branches, feeling the weight of those promises settle over him like a gentle flame. Local residents spoke of strange things, moments when hope seemed to bloom out of nowhere, when a stranger's words healed wounds that no medicine could touch. Samuel realized these were the unseen echoes of Eli's work, now carried on by those who dared to believe in light beyond darkness. Among them was a woman named Mary, who had found her voice again after years of silence, simply because someone once told her, "Your story deserves to be heard." As Samuel walked through the town square, he noticed a mural being painted, a vibrant depiction of a man walking through fire, hands raised not in anger, but in grace. Below it was inscribed, "The flame passes through us all." It was a message of continuity, a reminder that the fire was never one man's alone. It lived in every act of courage, every whispered prayer, every choice to carry hope forward despite the odds. That evening, as twilight wrapped the town in quiet colors, Samuel lit a candle at the base of the mural. The flame flickered warmly, reflecting the faces of those gathered around him. They didn't know his full story, but they understood the truth behind it. Light, once kindled, cannot be extinguished by absence or fear. It grows, it spreads, it becomes the very air we breathe. Samuel felt a deep peace settle in his bones. He was no longer searching for answers or chasing shadows. He was part of a living story, one written in embers and song, passed from heart to heart. And as the firelight danced across the faces before him, he knew that this was the true legacy Eli had left behind. Not a man lost to time, but a flame never allowed to fade. The final chapter of Samuel's journey wasn't marked by fanfare or revelation. Instead, it was a quiet return, a pilgrimage to the bridge where the badge had first been found 34 years ago. The river flowed steadily beneath him, its waters shimmering with the soft glow of dawn. Samuel stood alone, The music box cradled gently in his hands and allowed the melody to fill the morning air one last time. The notes floated on the breeze, weaving through trees and touching distant hills, carrying with them the stories of all those who had been touched by Eli's fire. Samuel closed his eyes and imagined the countless lives transformed by the preacher's silent revolution. Those who had found strength in darkness, hope in despair, and light in the smallest flicker of grace. He understood then that the badge, the music, the fires, they were all symbols of a greater truth. He placed the music box carefully on the ground and knelt beside it. With a steady hand, he buried it beneath the earth, not as an end, but as a seed, a promise that the flame would rise again, carried by those who listened, who believed, and who chose to light the way. As he covered the box with soil, a soft breeze stirred, as if the world itself breathed a sigh of gratitude. Samuel stood, feeling the weight of the journey lift gently from his shoulders. The fire was no longer his alone to bear. It was a shared flame, passed silently from hand to hand, heart to heart, generation to generation. Eli Monroe had vanished from sight, but his light had become eternal, woven into the fabric of countless lives, a quiet blaze that no darkness could ever consume. As the sun rose fully over the river, Samuel walked away from the bridge with a final thought echoing in his mind. Some stories don't end. They transform. They live on in every flicker of kindness, every whispered hope, every soul brave enough to carry the flame forward. And in that truth, Eli Monroe, and all who followed him, were truly never gone. The story of Reverend Eli Monroe is not simply about a man who vanished. It is about the enduring flame he lit within the hearts of countless souls. Throughout this journey, we have seen how fire, in its many forms, does not just destroy. It reveals, transforms, and ultimately connects us. Eli's legacy lives not in the fading embers of his disappearance, but in the unbroken chain of light passed quietly from one person to another, through acts of courage, compassion, and truth. What makes this story truly extraordinary is its reminder that we all carry a flame within us, sometimes hidden, sometimes smoldering, but never fully extinguished. It challenges us to consider, how do we tend to our own fire? Do we let it burn out in fear, or do we nurture it, allowing it to illuminate not only our path, but the paths of those around us? Eli's journey invites us to become keepers of light, even when the world feels heavy with darkness. As you reflect on this tale, remember that legacy is not measured by fame or recognition, but by the quiet impact we leave on others. The vanished preacher did not seek glory, he sought change. And change begins with each small act of listening, of standing up for truth, and of carrying hope forward in the face of uncertainty. The fire that Eli kindled is within all of us, waiting only for us to acknowledge it and let it burn bright. If this story moved you, let it inspire a spark within your own life. Think about the fires you face, whether struggles, secrets, or fears, and how confronting them might lead to your own transformation. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story could be the light that helps someone else find their way. Together, we become part of a community that honors those who carry the flame when no one else can. Finally, if you want to continue exploring stories that ignite your soul and challenge your perspective, make sure to subscribe to this channel. Like this video if it touched you, and join the conversation below. Every click, every comment, every subscription helps us spread these powerful narratives farther, reaching hearts that need light. Thank you for listening, and for choosing to carry the flame with us.